Hello again. Um, we're resuming our lecture today on the history of the Vietnam War, and we tried to move through the French period, the French War between 46 and 54. It culminates, of course, in a great battle, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and we will come to that in due course. But it's quite significant in terms of the later American involvement, because it's during this French period, this French conflict with the Viet Minh, that the Americans are drawn into the situation in China, and it become the Americans begin to see it as part of the battle against communism, the Cold War, the policy of containment, and so the Americans develop a real stake in the future of Vietnam, and this draws them into the conflict. Is there anything that's left over from last time that you want to discuss? Very good. Well, I would like to pick up from last time. Last time I spoke about the fact that when the war started with the French in November 46, the Viet Minh at first tried to drive the the French out, engaging in big battles with the French in order to do so, but in fact they lost. The Viet Minh were beaten by the French. The French had artillery, they had aircraft, and the Viet Minh forces were no match in these big battles. So it was that the Viet Minh, by the middle of 1947, went back to a guerrilla strategy against the French, and they began to work out an alternative military strategy, a long-term strategy based on the concept of protracted war and attrition. And the reason I'm going back to it is because it's so important not only because it was the basis on which they defeated the French, but it's also these basic military doctrines were more or less the same and the basis of which they defeated the Americans. So to understand this strategy is quite important. So I said last time that in particular, they were influenced by the military writings of Mao Zedong in China, who'd been in conflict with the Japanese, and of course was in conflict with the nationalists. And we can see these doctrines as a kind of adaptation of Maoist military doctrine to the circumstances in Vietnam. And in the first place, I noted that Vietnam is a small country, China is a big country, and that as a result of that, the Chinese communists had large areas in the West and especially in the north of China, which the Japanese and the KMT, the nationalists, could not reach. So these were the so-called strategic rear areas of the Chinese communists. And as some of you might know, that during much of the 1930s and throughout the Second World War, the Chinese communists were holed up fighting the Japanese in northern China, in areas which were remote from the Japanese, and it was there that they basically struck at first the Japanese and later on the KMT. But no such rear area existed in Vietnam, and so the Vietnamese adopted another way of carrying on what they call the People's War. That is to say, there was no strategic rare areas, so it was the People's War had to be based on the popular support in the villages. That this People's War, they insisted that the jungles and mountains where they were taking refuge was in the villages of the people, and they had to rely. Of course, the Chinese communists relied on popular support. Don't get me wrong, but it was all the more so with the case of the Vietnamese. It was in the villages, in the popular committees and the village militias that the Vietnamese communists or the Viet Minh drew their support. And the People's War based on the villages was all the more important because the guerrillas now fighting the French in terms of feeding these guerrillas, hiding these guerrillas, giving them intelligence about the movements of the French, where they were, and so on. It was precisely from these villages who knew the terrain, who had an intimate understanding of the terrain, that the guerrilla forces of the Viet Minh were constituted. And of course, the village militias play a very important role. So on this basis, then, of course, the Viet Minh developed a certain tactical mobility. Basing themselves on the villages, they could, having this intelligence and having the material support, they could move easily and rapidly. They learned to move easily and rapidly to strike out at the French. And of course, part of this doctrine calls for the fact that the guerrillas should use hit and run tactics. Let us say you suddenly strike and surprise the enemy, you ambush the enemy, and you inflict casualties, wounded and dead on the French, and in this way you carry on a war of attrition, and you wear the enemy out in this way. And of course, while you're doing all this, of course, you're making propaganda in the villages and even in the towns. You invade with the guerrillas. They're all armed, and you carry on a kind of ideological propaganda war again, mobilizing support amongst the population in general. And so this is the kind of warfare that the Viet Minh carry on from the middle of 1947 onwards. And this is the way this is described in the newspaper of the Viet Minh during October. This is an editorial from October 1947. They're describing the way the Viet Minh are carrying on this war. The enemy attacks us on top, so we attack him underneath. The enemy attacks us in the north, so we attack him in central and southern Vietnam. And also we spread the war into Cambodia and Laos. In other words, we force the French to spread themselves out, making them weaker overall so that we can attack them at their vulnerable points. The enemy violates one of our territorial bases. We immediately strike hard at the enemy's belly and back. The enemy comes and goes, and we cut off his legs by destroying his roads. Regular units and people's guerrilla units coordinate their actions with each other according to conditions and rise up and annihilate the enemy. Now, this sort of guerrilla war is not an end in itself, I would say. No, it's to wear out the French, but it's also gradually supposed to allow the Viet Minh to, based on the people's militias, to become stronger and stronger. While the French are gradually being worn down, the people's war is getting stronger and stronger. And this is very important because at the end of the day, according to these doctrines, yes, guerrilla war is important, and it's important to keep carrying it out. But ultimately, you want to create regional, regular units. And indeed, ultimately, you want to create main force units, which can ultimately, if they have enough strength, they can take on the French directly in positional war. And so it's not correct to see this war as simply a guerrilla war. No, they want the guerrilla war to lead up to positional warfare, on a new basis, on a stronger basis. You build up regular main force units, which can ultimately take on the French again, toe to toe, and defeat them in regular battle. And it is this style of warfare which the Viet Minh used to ultimately defeat the French at Dien Bien Phu, because Dien Bien Phu was ultimately a big battle. While they were carrying on the guerrilla war, they ultimately defeated the French in positional war. And they were going to apply the same principles in the war against the Americans, because the war against the Americans was certainly a guerrilla war, but the Vietnamese also used main force units, most of them coming down from North Vietnam, regiments and ultimately divisions coming from North Vietnam, increasingly confronted the mercenary soldiers of the South Vietnamese and the Americans. So that is the style of war that was carried on. It's not simply a guerrilla war. Does anybody have any questions about what I've said? Okay. Now, while this guerrilla war is going on, of course, the Viet Minh try to sort of maintain a kind of structure. So remember that the DRV was created in 1945. Well, there was a kind of administrative structure that emerged, and the Vietnamese communists tried to maintain that structure as best they could. They also had, of course, the United Front of the Viet Minh. That was also more or less intact, and they used that as well. And then, of course, within the administrative structure of the DRV, which was, of course, clandestine, and the Viet Minh itself was, of course, the Communist Party, which is kind of nesting within the administration of the DRV and the Viet Minh. Now, that is the structure of we can say, the communist side. But the French, while they were fighting the war, as the war began, the French had about 50,000 French troops, French Foreign Legionnaire troops in Vietnam. They were the most important, the core of the army, but they also employed about 250,000 paid troops, recruits from the Vietnamese people. The French were able to get 250,000 Vietnamese to fight with them. Ultimately, that number increased as the war went on year after year until you get to 52, 53, 54. The Vietnamese troops fighting alongside the French, 500,000, 600,000, so-called mercenary troops fighting alongside the French, opposing the Viet Minh, who at their height had something like 350,000 men. So the French had more troops than did the Viet Minh during this conflict. And of course, the French had their artillery, their tanks, and their air force, which they could invoke against the forces of the Viet Minh. And so what the French did is basically, as the war unfolded, they basically took over all the cities and towns. And at the same time, they try in the countryside, they tried to occupy the strategic hills, mountains, and crossroads. They couldn't occupy the entire countryside. The French didn't have the means, but they located their artillery and their strong points at the crossroads, the major crossing points, the hills and mountains from which they could survey the countryside. This is the way the French operated. And this is the way the war unfolded. However, in October of 1947, the French launched a major offensive. This is October 1947. And here you see, this is the northernmost part of Tonkin, the northernmost part of Vietnam. This is near the Chinese border. This area, this is the first area that the Viet Minh had established themselves, and Ho Chi Minh had established themselves. And it was very much under the control of the Viet Minh. So from Hanoi, where this is the capital of North Vietnam, the French General Tassigny, launches a major offensive. He knows this is basically the headquarters of the Viet Minh. And so French forces in a surprise attack moved northward in October 1947, trying to take the Viet Minh leadership by surprise. Well, Ho Chi Minh and the other leaders escape, but the French successfully kill about 10,000 Viet Minh troops, wound a lot more, and scatter the Viet Minh. And so this attack, October 1947, is relatively quite successful, I would say. However, despite this French victory, the Viet Minh, by this time, the Viet Minh are operating all over Vietnam, north and south, down to Cochin. There are guerrilla forces operating. And the French are not able to suppress the movement. The movement basically acquires a second breath. And so as a result of that, we can say by the middle of 1948, the Viet Minh are carrying out guerrilla operations right through the country. And at various points, they're attacking some of the towns. They are constituting secret guerrilla cells, both in Saigon in the south and in Hanoi in the north. There are these guerrilla units that are operating in the urban areas. And the guerrilla units particularly are active in the Saigon area and in the Hanoi region. Meanwhile, the Viet Minh have also established contact with guerrillas in Cambodia and in Laos. In Cambodia and Laos, the Viet Minh has established relations, with so there is the Viet Minh, but in Cambodia, there is a nationalist communist movement known as the Khmer Issarak, or the Free Khmer Movement, the Free Cambodian Movement, Khmer Issarak. And in Laos, they establish contact and support, the Viet Minh do, another guerrilla movement amongst the Laotian people known as the Laotian Liberation Movement. And why do they do this? Because they're trying to spread the war throughout Indochina, forcing the French to disperse their forces. They're widening the war by involving Cambodia and involving Laos in the guerrilla war against the French. And this, of course, dissipates or forces the French forces, that forces the French to fight on three fronts rather than one front, to fight not simply in Vietnam, but also to fight in neighboring Cambodia and Laos, which of course are part of French Indochina. Are there any questions about this? Okay, so.
Wait, how did the movement happen?
Well, there had remember there was such a thing as the French Indochina Party. It was created in 1931. The Communist Party in Vietnam was not simply confined to Vietnam, because this party was called the Indochina Communist Party. So there were cells of the Communist Party in Laos and in Cambodia. Partly the reason for this was that the Vietnamese craftsmen and others lived in Cambodia and Laos. There were Vietnamese small merchants and craftsmen with communist sympathies living in Laos and Cambodia. So they joined the Indochina Communist Party. And they were instrumental in basically creating these very strongly nationalist movements. I would stress that, the Pathet Lao and the Khmer Issarak at the same time. So the French had to fight in Laos and Cambodia as well as in Vietnam. So gradually, this strategy of people's war, attrition, spreading the movement into Cambodia and Laos begins to have its effect. And so we find that by October 1949, in the newspaper of the Viet Minh movement, we find the following account of the progress of the Viet Minh in developing this war, this people's war against the French. This is what it says. The date of this editorial is 31 October 1949. The war has basically been going on for 3 years. And this is what is said. Now our armed and semi-armed forces have 3 categories: the main force units, the regional units, and the people's guerrilla forces in the villages. They're claiming that it's not simply in the villages that we have these guerrilla units. We've constituted regional units and also main force units. We have 3 kinds of units. And this is the way they describe their operations. Each category has a concrete responsibility. The main force units maneuver, they fight big battles, and train and lead the regional units in a coordinated struggle. The regional forces have the responsibility of protecting the region, leading the people's guerrilla units in the villages, and conducting armed propaganda, harassing and tarring the enemy, and advancing in cooperation with the main force units. The people's guerrilla units in the villages protect the village, pay attention to strengthening the village, destroying and exterminating traitors and spies, and developing into regional forces to take the place of some of the regional forces that enter the main force. So you see that the guerrilla war carries on, but beyond that, has developed kind of regional forces and main force units who are actually carrying on significant operations against the French. Now, this is the situation as through most of 1949, but in October 1949, this is a real turning point. Something really big occurs. October 1949. What happens in October 1949? It doesn't happen in Vietnam itself. It happens in another country, October 1949. Big turning point. What is that? Does anybody remember?
Is it that China falls to communism?
Exactly. And this is incredibly important because, of course, it means the Vietnamese, who have not had a rear area, strategic rear area, now have China as their strategic rear area. And now China is the People's Republic of China and is fully in support of the Vietnamese revolution and movement, the Viet Minh movement against the French. This gigantic country is now in support of the Viet Minh fighting the French. That has vast implications, as you'll see. No sooner does that happen than the French, who have all along been negotiating with the non-communist elements in Vietnam. The French carried on this negotiation all the time the war was with those who were not supporting the Viet Minh. And there were, I would say they were a minority, but nevertheless a significant minority. I'm talking about the fact that you have the landlords, you have much of the middle class, you have most, but not all, the Catholics. Remember that, the Catholics, I would say not all the Catholics. Some of the Catholics patriotically joined the Viet Minh, but others, because of the Buddhist Catholic antagonism, sided with the French, who had always supported the Catholics in Vietnam. But there were also these Buddhist military sects, militarized sects, that also were opposed to the Viet Minh. And as the war progressed, I would say that whereas the middle class, some of the middle class and some of the landlords who had initially supported the Viet Minh, they came to the understanding that the Viet Minh were fundamentally based on the peasants and were communists. And so politically, they were looking for a way out. They gave up their support for the Viet Minh. And at the head of all of this was the old emperor of Vietnam, an individual by the name of Bao Dai. Now, all along through the French occupation of Vietnam, dating from the beginning of the 20th century, the French supported, they have, of course, controlled the country, but they supported a puppet emperor. There were a succession of puppet emperors. And the last of these was an individual by the name of Bao Dai. Now, Bao Dai had been in office right through the Japanese occupation. At the end of the Japanese occupation, with the declaration of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, Bao Dai was basically disgraced. And so he resigned in 1945. Well, now the French decide we're going to bring him back. And so with the Chinese Communist victory at the end of 1949, the French now sign what they call the Élysée Accords. Élysée is a palace in Paris. And Bao Dai is put in as the head of this new government, and the French now recognize if you like, a Vietnamese government, not the DRV. Of course, they reject the DRV, they reject the Viet Minh. A new government, which is now becoming part of the so-called French Union. This is all in the wake of the victory of the Chinese the communists in China, because they can see the handwriting on the wall. With the Vietnamese victory, with the Chinese victory, the Chinese are very soon going to support the Viet Minh. And unless the French can get real support amongst the Vietnamese, it's hopeless to carry on this war. So they set up basically a puppet government under Bao Dai, and they appealed to the United States of America for support. The Americans have already given some support, but now in 1950, the Americans decide that despite the fact that from a strictly military point of view, the future does not look that bright, that they have to support the French and this, well, I'll call it Bao Dai government. They know that the Bao Dai government is not that popular, but they decide that they're going to support them and support the French. And over the next 3 or so years, the Americans give something like $3.5 billion of military aid to the French. Now, I ask you, what were the motives for the Americans doing this? They realized that, in a way, the military situation was not that promising, but nevertheless, they committed themselves to this. Why did they do this? What were the reasons? Anybody have any thoughts?
To stop communism from spreading anymore.
Yes.
And did they also have another ulterior motive as well with the colonial? They also wanted to keep the colonials as well. I'm not entirely sure about that.
Yeah, yes. No, what they wanted as much as possible is for the French to concede as much autonomy. They kept pushing the French, give the Vietnam, this new government some real powers. This was the American attitude. You can, in the background, continue to control the situation, but you have to give some real concede powers to Bao Dai and his ministers. Otherwise, it's a farce. That was the American attitude. Meanwhile, they're bringing in as much military support as they can. And this $3.5 billion in 1950s dollars is a substantial amount of money. So the fundamental reason is the containment of communism. Now, that policy had begun as early as 1946 on a global basis. You should understand that the Cold War got started. But what also happened in 1950 in Asia, which sort of reinforced this policy, a war broke out. Where was this war?
The Korean War.
Exactly. The Korean War broke out. The Korean War breaks out in June of 1950. And the American view, although this is not true, is that this is basically a continuation of the communist takeover of China. Now they want to take over Korea as well. And so, of course, and the North Korean forces, the war begins with a huge offensive by the communists from North Vietnam, North Korea into South Korea. So the Americans say, well, we have to contain the communists in Korea. And damn it, we have to help the French to contain the communists in Vietnam as well. So you can see this policy taking shape. It's part of a global policy of containment, and it's also an Asian policy of containing communists. The communists in China, above all, are seen as the threat. Does anybody else want to say something about this? Now, I don't want to leave it at the strategic level alone, because inside the United States, as a result of the fall of China to the communists, you have within the United States a huge anti-communist reaction. Does anybody know the name of this anti-communist movement within the United States?
The Red Scare.
The Red Scare. And who was the political figure who was basically orchestrating this Red Square. Does anybody know his name?
McCarthy.
Yes, this is the development of McCarthyism within the United States. The communists are taking over the world. And there are secret communists within the United States who wish to make the United States, this of course is still going on, of course, these ideas, who wish to make the United States communist. And so the right wing, but not merely the right wing, the Democratic Party basically accepts this viewpoint in order to show that they are as anti-communist as the Republicans in the United States. The two parties begin to compete for who is more anti-communist. And so Truman completely buys the idea we've got to contain the communists in Korea, and we have to contain the communists in Vietnam by supporting the French. There is one other factor that also has to be brought in. China has fallen to the communists. This is terrible, but we do have an ally in this area that, well, we can't rely on China anymore, and the China market is lost to us. But we do have a major power in this region that we can use as the basic strategic point from which we can contain the spread of communism. And this is, of course, Japan. We have defeated Japan. Japan is dependent on us. We have military bases in Japan, and we are going to build up Japan as an alternative to China. This will become our major ally. And so it is in 1951, they sign a peace treaty with Japan. And they begin slowly to allow Japan to remilitarize. And whereas they had neglected the Japanese economy was not doing that well until the outbreak of the Korean War. Now they realize they have to build up the Japanese economy. This is the beginning of the recovery of Japan. And you'll notice they are beginning to build up Japan, and they are also now beginning to build up West Germany, which becomes the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949. These are the two wings. America is the heart of the anti-communist resistance, but West Germany and Japan become the two wings of this attempt to contain communism. Now, in this respect, look at Vietnam. It's not merely a question of containment. Vietnam has rice, it has rubber, it has coal. The Japanese economy needs these resources. And so holding on to Vietnam is very important. So it's strategic, but it's also economic in terms, it's not that the Americans are dependent directly on the Vietnamese economy, of course not. But their ally needs the raw materials, just like they need oil from Malaya, and they need the Philippines. The Japanese need access to Vietnam. So for all of these reasons, the Americans now begin to take the war in Vietnam very seriously. Meanwhile, of course, the Chinese, they have come to power, the communists have come to power in October 1950. They begin to give significant military aid to the Viet Minh from about April 1950. Weapons and Chinese military advisors begin clandestinely to move into North Vietnam. Moreover, thousands and thousands of Viet Minh troops crossed the frontier into China where they undergo training and re-equipment by the Chinese Red Army. In other words, they are refitted and trained in order to take on the French. And so essentially both sides, this polarization, the stakes are rising in the course of 1950. Now, let me find my place. Now, the now, this then sets the stage for the battles that begin to develop during the course of late 1950 and 1951, 1952. And the first battle I want to one should note that the big battles of this I'm now going to be describing the series of battles that lead up to the ultimate conflict, the ultimate military conflict at Dien Bien Phu. And all of these conflicts from late 1950 until 1954 basically take place in Tonkin, in this region up here. Tonkin has about 30% of, it's a vital area. The Red River runs through it, and 30% of the population of Vietnam live in this region. And even more important is the fact that, of course, China is just north of this region. And so the control of Tonkin is vital. And so it's in this region that the main battles occur. And you'll note here, this is the delta of the Red River. The Red River runs down from China, and in the middle of this delta, right here, is Hanoi, and then on the coast is the port of Haiphong. That is the situation. The land gradually as you move from the delta, this region here is made up of hills. So here it's flat land, it's heavily populated villages, at the center of which are the two cities of Haiphong and Hanoi. Now, in terms of these battles, the key figure from the point of view of the French is their general. General de Tassigny is the French general at the start of these campaigns. And on the Viet Minh side, and more important, is this brilliant Vietnam general by the name of Vo Nguyen Giap. General Giap is the Viet Minh commander. Now, General Giap, so brilliant is he that, if you can believe it, he's the guy who defeats the French, and he's the guy who basically defeats the Americans. And he is one of the major sort of military figures in military history. His conceptions, my description of People's War. People's War, as it was applied in Vietnam, was largely the invention of General Giap. And he conceives the policies that basically defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu, and later on, the strategy that defeated the Americans. In fact, the Americans came to respect him to such a point that years later, after the war, the Americans invited Giap to the United States and honored him. He was received with honor in Washington, if you can believe, because the generals in the Pentagon had come to sort of respect him to such a degree that after the conflict ended, they ultimately gave honor to General Giap. Well, I'll describe Giap and describe the successive battles that led up to Dien Bien Phu in the next class.